Well, it's time for another commentary video, and this is something that it's kind of late on a Tuesday night, but I wanted to get this out of my head before I forget. Um, I've noticed a trend in some of the uh, alternative podcasts dealing with, uh, I guess what you'd call Fortean subjects, the things like Bigfoot and researching the unexplained, the cattle mutilation phenomenon, UFOs, some of the conspiracy culture and things like that. And I've noticed a trend in some of the material that delves into those subjects. And today I was digging into this. I thought there's got to be a term for it. And sure enough, there's got to be a label for this technique or this approach. And there is. So in the sitcom world, there's something that's referred to as the status quo is God, or the other one is failure is the only option. And what this is referring to is in sitcoms, like a great example from my childhood, of course, is Gilligan's Island. That the way the format for those types of shows is that, again, the status quo is where the show starts at this point. It goes all over the place, and then it winds up exactly at that place at the end. So there's never a game-changing, permanent change to the plot that would affect later episodes. And what that does, that's a very convenient device for reruns and things like that, because one, it contributes to the comedy of the show. Gilligan always screws it up and they wind up on the island or whatever. But The Simpsons is a good example of that, where all these crazy things, Homer goes to space, but then he winds up right back working at the nuclear plant the next episode. So it's played for laughs in the sitcom world, but it's a convenient device to allow television shows and everything to wind up in somewhat of a modular format. So when they rerun, they could rerun them all out of order and they still work, because those 2 points, the beginning and the end, are always the same. And something I've noticed in the some of the conspiracy circles, and it's really not so much the conspiracy circles as much as I would say the Fortean, and I'm saying that Fortean, the Fortean world, named after Charles Fort, who was one of the first ones to popularize that kind of delving into the unknown and mysterious phenomenons and things like that. These podcasters, and Joe Rogan does this to a lesser degree, but this whole idea of you start off with an intriguing, mysterious, edgy topic. And you even throw some fuel on the fire and say, wow, there's some crazy stuff going on. We got, there's, let's say, for example, the Kennedy assassination. And I'm going to use this one because this is one that's out there. And I think there's even a book written about this. But I've heard a lot of people repeat this with gusto. And it goes something like this, that the Kennedy assassination was yes, there's this cover up, and yes, here's all this evidence of these specific groups that are covering these things up. We can prove this, we can prove this guy was here, this guy was acting weird, and all this stuff. But then, as we get closer to the end, we realize that, you know what? The fatal headshot fired at John F. Kennedy was actually from a security guard that misfired his weapon, had a negligent discharge, and blew off the back of John F. Kennedy's head, and it was just a tragic mistake. So of course they're going to cover it up because it's a terrible thing. So go back to sleep, everything's just the way it should. So again, we have that starting point of everything's the way it normally is, and we introduce some new information, and we start going all over the place with it. And you, the audience, start going, man, this is crazy. There's definitely evidence of a cover-up. And then we find out, you know what? Of course, there's evidence of a cover-up because it was just a tragic mistake. And nobody wants to admit to accidentally shooting the president in the back of the head. I mean, so my point with this is I've noticed this trend being applied in the the world of some certain podcasts, and I don't want to name any names. I don't want to attack anybody particularly, but it's a very safe approach that brings you right back to where you're supposed to be, so there's no change. And that's one of the things you'll find with a lot of the kind of research that I talk about on this channel, is there are certain topics, like a good example of this is the Franklin scandal or the Finders case. There are certain cases that once you know the particulars of that case, it's impossible not to have that change your worldview. And this is where we get into this situation where that status quo is so important, because if you think about something, there's a very different human condition of thinking or knowing. And thinking is kind of an intellectual exercise, but when I take on new information and I know that new information, that is potentially behavioral changing or life-changing even information that could drastically steer your choices. It could cause you to say no to a lot of things and say, that's corrupt, that's wrong, that's bad, that's, heaven forbid, that's evil. And when you look at things like the Franklin scandal or the Finders case, it's very difficult to look at those situations and not see them as unequivocally evil, and the participants in those things as being, quantifiably evil. And I've noticed there's a lot of and I don't know if this is because some of these people have been compromised, or if there's a certain amount of just moral cowardice that they just don't want to address certain things. They want to wind up right back at that point. But there are certain authors, investigators that I've seen do that, where they stumble onto some amazing information that from an objectively looking at this data, you'd be like, there's no way you could go back. There's no way we can, once Gilligan gets access to a speedboat, we're leaving the island. We can't wind up here again. And so you almost have to work to crash the speedboat to wind up back where you were at the beginning. And sorry for the Gilligan's Island. Those of you younger people are probably not going to get that as well. But that was kind of the shtick on the show, was that they would get very close to getting off the island. They'd build a radio set out of scrap boat parts and whatnot, and be able to almost radio for help, and then Gilligan would come shuffling through and screw it all up, break the radio, and now they're right back to where they started. And I've seen that a lot with a lot of, again, researchers that I respect a lot of the information they've uncovered, but it's kind of like they got to the edge and were like, oh, holy crap, and they bring themselves right back to where they need to be. And one of the few exceptions, I will name this name because in a positive light, Nick Bryant is a very positive exception to that, and he's even said several times on his podcast, on his channel, about how some of this stuff, like once you know what happened in the Franklin scandal, you can't go back. There's no prosaic explanation for what was happening in Nebraska in the late 80s. So you really have to work to try to steer yourself back to that point. And I find that interesting that's kind of when you start getting into the more mainstream treatments of a lot of the conspiracy topics, especially in the last 15 years or so. I've seen that more and more of this effort, and especially in the last, I would say, 8 or 9 years, really since the past offense episode. I can't even say the word because YouTube will censor me for that. So past offense, figure out that on your own. But that episode, I think a lot of people kind of got their mind right, and they started publishing books and videos and everything that steered people right back to where they need to be, so we don't get off the island. But that's where the whole failure is the only option is. That's both of those. The status quo is God and failure is the only option. Both of those are cliches within sitcom writing of steering everything back to the original point so that all the plot devices remain intact, and that you don't have like Three's Company or something like that, where they win the lottery and then the show's over. So unless you have a season finale where they suddenly get rescued from the island, every show has to be returned to normal. And that's the thing with thinking versus knowing. A lot of those follow that pattern of, gee, I think that might have been X, Y, and Z. But as soon as you cross that threshold from thinking to knowing, that affects behavior. That will, you can't help but change your behavior, your interactions with people, your desire for justice, your desire to, and I'm not talking taking up arms against anyone or doing anything drastic. I'm simply talking about saying no. If you realize an experimental medication is a potentially fatal choice to make, you would be more inclined to, once you know that that is experimental and hasn't gone through the right checks and balances, you would do well to say no to that. And that's where we get into this area of where our, kind of the establishment, the official authorities, legacy media and all that, really likes to keep us in our lane where we think about things, but we don't know them. We stay kind of in this very, very safe spot on our little island, and we can think all over the place, but as long as we return before we start engaging again, as long as we're sitting in front of our TV set, we can come up with crazy ideas, but we're going to be led right back to we're staying on the island. And I'm curious if any of you have seen examples of that. Like I'm not going to name any. I don't want to flip that rock over and start that with anybody anywhere, because like I said, there's a lot of people that I really respect their research and respect their opinions on a lot of things, but I also can't help but see that they'll get right up to that line and then pull back because they know that that to step over that line is big. And the giveaway is a lot of these people that have uncovered, and again, Nick Bryant is a positive exception to this, of Nick Bryant, where they'll discover information that you're like, how could you know X, Y, and Z and not have that change your worldview? Another example of that was in the book Project Beta. I think it was Rick Doty, the very the very outspoken disinformation agent from the late 80s, who I think it was the Myrna Hansen abduction. And that's a real problem because she, in her abduction, when she was regressed and started remembering all this stuff, she remembered going to this secret underground facility and was describing the security protocols to go in through some of these doors. And what she described matched some of the facilities at Kirtland Air Force Base, like the Monzano nuclear complex, to a T. And the explanation that I think Rick Doty offers for the book Project Beta is that she must have had this like remote viewing experience where she somehow was able to see through space and time and see that. And it's like, which is more plausible, that she had this bizarre remote viewing experience where she somehow was able to see a super secure nuclear facility, or maybe she was taken to a similar facility with similar security measures. So anyway, those are that approach I've seen a lot more in lately, and there's Adam Gorightly's book, Saucers, Spooks, and Kooks, was kind of one of the things I saw in that vein, where he brings up a lot of really good evidence and really good information in that book. And somebody was getting on to me for, I can't believe you say you don't like this book and you're talking about it for 16 minutes. And it had a lot of really good information, but it did the whole Gilligan's Island thing. Talked about a lot of stuff, but then it's like, but that's dangerous. We can't, those are dangerous thoughts that could get us in trouble. So we're going to go right back. We're going to wreck the speedboat and we're going to stay on the island. That approach, that kind of Gilligan's Island approach, and that might be the best way to sum that up. I'm curious if any of you have seen that. And then the other approach I've seen as a way to dismiss any kind of evidence, any kind of data that might cause you to know things that could be problematic is, and I haven't figured out a good analogy for this, but my wife and I were talking about this afternoon about movies that we've seen where you get to the end and the ending is kind of overwhelmingly devoid of a real uh, uh, conclusion. It concludes in a way that it's kind of like it's the solution to the problem is too big to really understand or know. And I was trying to think of some examples for this video and I couldn't think of any in time. But you get that approach too sometimes where when the Gilligan's Island approach doesn't work, instead it's, well, cattle mutilations are probably done, and I'm just going to use this as an example, they're probably done by some kind of fifth dimensional skinwalker or something, and it's so far out there we're never going to really understand it. And you know, gee, isn't this a curious thing to kind of tinker around with in our brain, but we're never going to know. So it's so far out, so far removed from our experience and what we can even know as humans. It's better not to even waste our time with it. And again, we can use this as kind of an intellectual exercise. We can talk about it, but it's way out there. It exceeds our understanding. And what that does is that takes us away from even examining the more prosaic evidence that we have right in front of us. And instead we say, you know, it's just too much. So I'm just going to step back and go, wow, that's crazy. And again, it becomes kind of campfire talk. We can talk about how crazy that is, and then we all get up and go our separate ways the next day, but it's never going to actually lead anyone to any action. And I'm just going to wrap this up by saying, when I say action, I don't mean any kind of antisocial action. I just mean the very simple action of saying no to things that are corrupt, of pointing out the corruption and saying that behavior is evil, that behavior is corrupt and bad, that is exploiting children, that is bad, let's stop that. Or I refuse to go along with this. You know, I may not be able to, I don't have the resources to stop X, Y, or Z, but I can say no, and I can encourage my friends to say no to that thing. So anyway, I just want to get that out there. This was something kind of, I watched a few of these lately, podcasts along those lines that I had high hopes for, and then I was like, dag blast it, they wrecked the speedboat and they're staying on the island. So I'm curious if you all have run into that, but again, if I were to coin a phrase for it, I would say that probably the Gilligan's Island syndrome, and of, you know, returning to the status quo. But if you look that up, if you look up this afternoon, I was trying to figure out what the terminology for that is in the world of sitcom writing, and it's called either the status quo is God or failure is the only option. And again, great plot device for sitcoms, great way to keep your plot devices and your humor devices intact. Terrible when you are trying to actually unravel human corruption. So I'll leave it at that, and I'd love to hear your input.